Okay, guys, so this is the last part of the lecture, and we were just talking about the Lisbon strategy. So, the Lisbon strategy led to kind of an intensification of this marketization of higher education. So, the Bologna process kind of laid the groundwork there for higher education institutions across the European Union to work together and also to kind of, I suppose, more easily serve the needs of the modern economy. The Lisbon strategy really concretized the link between higher education, its ability to generate and disseminate knowledge, and the economic prosperity of the country. So it was a major move in support of a market orientated approach to higher education. And what it did is what it introduced market based structures as a means of, and I have it in inverted commas here, modernizing higher education. So obviously, discursively, the powers that be are trying to set up this idea that the only way for higher education to remain modern and able to cope with modern demands is to introduce some sort of market-based structures. Excuse me. Okay, and also was part of the arguments that national governments were using at this time as well is that they wanted to improve efficiency within higher education. So there was obviously a prevailing idea that higher education in some way was not acting as efficiently as it could. And it was a way of better positioning higher education to meet the challenges facing its new role within Europe's knowledge economy. So again, really concretizing that link between you are going to be our front line of creating new knowledge and you will become the means by which to drive economic activity within the country. And part of the challenges, these challenges that the European Union highlighted were ideas like deregulation of the system and allowing more private institutions to set up and compete within the marketplace, introducing professionalized management. So the idea being that academics were no longer seen as capable of running institutions on a business basis, and that there would now be more professionalized management structures in place. And also what they were looking at was there was an increasing drive towards competition based funding and research and output related funding for education as a whole. So instead of funding higher education as a public good and allowing it to fulfill its mission in that respect, they decided to adopt a more carrot and stick method, whereby the carrot of increased funding for research and the research output of universities would be used as a means for providing institutions with sufficient funding. So again, trying to gain more control over the higher education system. Now, not to, as you can probably guess from the tone of my voice as well when I'm delivering this, it didn't go unnoticed, and a purely market-based approach to higher education has been criticised widely on the basis of the idea that market structures have absolutely no place within higher education. There is a philosophy and function to higher education which is diametrically opposed to market structures. Unfortunately, though, in reality, higher education institutions are reliant on national governments for funding. So if the government decides that it wants to incentivize higher education institutions to behave in a certain manner with funding as the carrot, then unfortunately higher education institutions will increasingly move away from its philosophical and functional side of higher education, move towards a kind of a more market-based approach. And obviously as well, we're talking about, internationalization shouldn't necessarily just be responsive to market factors, but also we shouldn't be forgetting about higher education's social contract. The function of higher education is to educate the citizen, to allow people to develop personally and intellectually, not necessarily create drones for the labour market. So through these various developments, through the Bologna process and through the Lisbon strategy, what we see is that internationalization becomes a means of controlling higher education. So it moves from a fairly marginal position as an exotic add-on, as it had been prior to the Bologna and the Lisbon strategy. And now it's become basically a central issue for the future vitality of European higher education. And it's seen as a very powerful force as a means of transforming higher education. And it's seen as permeating all of the constituent parts of higher education as well. So internationalization and policies surrounding internationalization have huge impact on the current functioning of higher education institutions. So what we see then happening, if we think of the dominance of English, right at the very beginning we talked about the dominance of English in the various domains, including academia, we can then see that internationalization starts to move hand in hand with Englishization. And we see that very early on, even in the Bologna process. So from the very beginning, Bologna pledges to fully recognise and respect individual higher education systems, languages and cultures. So there's kind of an ideological rhetoric there of, yes, we will respect them, etc., etc. However, we see very early on, in 2003 at the Berlin conference in particular, we see a linguistic hierarchy starts to emerge when they start talking about the diploma supplement and how the diploma supplement will be issued and how to make it as widely recognised as possible. And of course, English enters the fold here, and it's decided that the diploma supplement will be offered in English. And then if we start looking at, this kind of new competitive market in higher education, what starts to emerge is that, well, for international student flows, the majority of these people that are looking for an internationalized education beyond their domestic context, they're looking for programs where they can study through a language that they understand well. Given the omnipresence of English, then we see higher education institutions in Europe starting to realize, well, actually, our linguistic diversity is a barrier to bringing in international students and colleagues. So if we want to try and overcome that, we need to start moving towards English medium instruction as a way of having a competitive advantage even within the European higher education area. So if we take countries like the Netherlands, Germany, Scandinavia and whatnot, these countries very early on had that competitive advantage, mainly due to the fact that they were countries in which the general level of English proficiency amongst its educated population was significantly higher than a lot of other European Union nation states. So what we can see from the early, from the 90s onwards, is that most European countries have kind of crossed the point of no return linguistically when it comes to their offering of modules and entire degree programs through the medium of English, so that internationalization discourse in the majority of continental European universities goes hand in hand with the provision of English programs, English modules, etc. Okay, so that's on the kind of the international side. So there's quite a lot of complex kind of factors going on and interacting there. If we turn to the domestic side, and again, this kind of relates to the graphic or the figure that was on the first slide. You can have a look back at that. But I'm going to focus here on 4 factors, even though these are specific to Germany within my own book, and they are seen as factors that are very easily having an impact in other contexts as well. So we see a cut to government expenditure and a move towards self-financing for institutions. So governments wanted to increasingly pull back their investment in higher education, frankly, because it was costing them quite a lot of money, and there was a feeling that they didn't have enough control over the sector and could not push the sector to move in such a way that they wanted it to. So they decided they were going to start cutting government expenditure and force universities to start self-financing through various methods, which of course impelled a lot of non-English speaking universities to move towards the adoption of English medium instruction in order to try and pull in as many fee-paying students internationally as possible. We also, and we've talked about this one quite a lot as well, that there was active acquisition planning for English taking place in the compulsory education systems of the majority of EU countries. So what we see is that governments are injecting less money into universities, and this causes universities to move towards English medium instruction more and more. And then the flip side, the resources that they're investing in compulsory education, they're bringing in policies and policy statements that English should become compulsory for everybody to learn in schools, and they make a lot of funding and a lot of resources available to make that move, to push English and to push people towards greater English proficiency. So we have this kind of form of acquisition planning taking place within compulsory education systems, which then further supports the introduction of English medium instruction at university level. As we've talked about quite a lot as well, that there's a very strong ideological positivity towards English. In particular, if you look at Northern Europe, if you talk about the Nordics, Scandinavia, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, there's a very strong ideological positivity towards English in all of these countries, so that the increased provision of English medium programs is not necessarily seen as a threat in any sort of way or seen as something problematic. In fact, it's seen as tapping into the really positive ideologies that people have already around English. And one of the major factors we see, particularly in Northern European countries, is that we have a decline in the number of students studying at higher education levels. So in many Northern European countries, there's a huge demographic change where effectively there are not enough young people being born, and therefore not enough young people going to universities. And because the numbers are falling of people going into university level in these countries start to look towards the international student market as a way to kind of fill this recruitment gap in their system. Of course, the economies in these countries, in order to be successful and vibrant, they need highly educated, highly trained staff coming out of universities, graduates coming out of universities. And so if there is already a recruitment gap there because of demographic changes, they need to maintain the level of graduation coming out of universities. They need more graduates coming out, skilled graduates to work in the labour market. So of course, universities start to look increasingly towards drawing students in from other countries where the demographics are more positive, that there are lots and lots of students at university going age. And of course, by drawing them in, giving them the education that they want through the medium of English, they can then also hold on to these graduates post-graduation and fulfill a kind of a brain gain as opposed to a brain drain situation that's been going on in the countries. Okay, so that's just a very brief overview of the various factors that have come together to create English medium instruction, particularly within the European context, and the various factors that have come together to impel the development of English medium instruction. So what we're seeing at this stage is that English medium instruction is starting to permeate all of the European higher education area, in particular the Northern European context. Netherlands, Germany, all the Scandinavian countries are moving increasingly towards EMI, certainly at master's and PhD level, but also increasingly at bachelor's level. And as a result of that, we're starting to see some really interesting sociolinguistic changes, and changes that are not necessarily going to be positive. So in the next 2 weeks of lectures on this module, we're going to look at what are the various challenges that some countries experience when introducing EMI, and what are the challenges that EMI poses for the sociolinguistic situation within the countries. Okay guys, thanks for your attention, and I will upload this onto Moodle along with the separate PowerPoint presentation, so you have that one for your files. And this approach to teaching will continue for the foreseeable future, so make sure to check in every Wednesday for a class time and go through the presentation. Thanks.